My name is John. Hope you enjoy this sleeping story. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe.
The engine finally surrendered with a wheeze that mirrored exactly how my bank account felt. I sat there for a moment in the sudden stillness, staring at what was apparently going to be my residence for the foreseeable future. The lodge looked like someone had taken a luxury ski resort and abandoned it in the wilderness for roughly 20 years too many. Massive timber beams, plenty of windows, but something about the proportions felt wrong, like it had been constructed for beings who were slightly larger than ordinary humans. The front entrance opened before I could even retrieve my bag from the back seat. "You must be Randy." The man approaching me looked like he'd stepped out of a corporate boardroom instead of the middle of nowhere. Pressed shirt, actual dress shoes, hair that had never been introduced to humidity. "I'm Peter Fitzgerald, but call me Paul. Peter's too formal for this place." I shook his hand, trying not to wince at how firm his grip was. "Thanks for the opportunity, Mr. Fitz. Paul, long drive, 4 days. My car isn't exactly engineered for cross-country." I grabbed my duffel bag and surveyed the surroundings. Trees everywhere, mountains in the distance, and absolutely nothing else. This is truly the middle of nowhere, isn't it? Paul smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "That's the point. Come on, let me show you around." The interior of the lodge was just as peculiar as the exterior. Everything was oversized. Doorways that could accommodate a refrigerator, ceilings that vanished into shadows, corridors that seemed to stretch endlessly. Paul maintained a steady stream of commentary as we walked, but I noticed he steered me away from certain areas without explanation. What he wasn't showing me mattered more than what he was. "Kitchen's fully stocked," he said, opening cabinets to reveal enough canned goods to outlast an apocalypse. "You'll be handling most of your own cooking. The work doesn't really permit regular meal breaks." "What exactly is the work?" I'd posed this question 3 times during our phone interviews and never received a direct answer. "Maintenance mostly. Monitoring systems. The lodge has some unique facilities that require overnight supervision." Paul moved toward the stairs. "Your room's up here." The bedroom was roughly what I'd anticipated. Single bed, dresser, window that looked out at more trees. What I hadn't anticipated was how thick the walls appeared, or the fact that the window had bars on it. Decorative ones, perhaps, but still bars. "The previous fellow left some things behind," Paul said, opening the closet to reveal a few shirts and a jacket. "Feel free to use whatever fits." "What happened to him?" "Found something better." Paul's tone suggested the conversation was finished. "Ready to discuss specifics?" We settled in the main room, which had a fireplace large enough to roast an entire deer, and furniture that looked like it had been constructed by someone who'd only heard furniture described secondhand. Paul produced a folder and began talking numbers. The salary he quoted made me blink twice. "That's, considerably more than you mentioned on the phone." "Hazard pay." "Hazard pay for what?" Paul waved the question away like it was a mosquito. "Isolation, mostly. Night shifts can be challenging. Speaking of which," he handed me a thick envelope, the kind attorneys use for important documents. "House rules. Read them tonight. Memorize them by tomorrow." The envelope felt heavy in my hands. "How many rules are there?" "Enough." Paul stood up. "We should head into town before it gets dark. You'll want to meet the locals." The drive carried us down a serpentine road that seemed designed to make you forget how to return. Paul kept both hands on the wheel and his eyes on the road, but he talked the entire time. "The townspeople are particular about certain things. They've been here a long time, and they have their customs." He took a curve a little too fast.
First rule, and this is important, never bring any of them back to the lodge, not for any reason. Okay. I waited for an explanation that didn't come. Why not? They don't mix well with the work environment. What kind of work environment doesn't permit visitors? Paul glanced at me for the first time since we'd gotten in the truck. The kind that pays what we're paying you. Fair point. I'd accepted jobs with stranger requirements for considerably less money. What else should I know? Never give them alcohol. They don't handle it well. Another curve, another warning. And if any of them ask for help, rides, phone calls, anything, the answer is always no. That seems rather harsh. It's for everyone's protection, including theirs. Paul's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. Randy, I'm going to be straight with you. This job isn't for everyone. The last 3 fellows didn't work out. What happened to them? They didn't follow the rules. The way he said it made my stomach twist slightly. And then what?
Then they weren't a good fit anymore. 3 people before me, all gone. All for the same reason, and I was about to sleep in their bed. I stared out the window at the trees rushing past. Every instinct I possessed was telling me to ask Paul to turn around, to drive me back to my car, to let me figure out some other way to restart my life. But I had maybe $200 left, no other job prospects, and nowhere else to go. Sometimes you don't get to choose between good options and bad ones. Sometimes you just get to choose between bad options and worse ones. I'll follow the rules, I said. Paul's shoulders relaxed slightly. Good. The work's not complicated once you get used to it. Mostly you'll be monitoring systems, doing basic maintenance, keeping an eye on things. What kind of things? You'll see. He slowed down as buildings appeared ahead of us. Here we are. The town looked like it had been built as a movie set for a generic small town, and then forgotten about. A few blocks of weathered buildings, some old cars parked along the street. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and strangers stick out like neon signs. Population's about 60, Paul said as we parked. Most of them work for the same company that runs the lodge. They're good people, but they keep to themselves. What company? Research outfit. Environmental studies mostly. Paul got out of the truck. Come on, I'll introduce you to a few key people. As we walked down the main street, I noticed curtains twitching in windows. People were watching us, but trying not to be obvious about it. The few locals I could see clearly looked normal enough, but there was something about the way they moved that seemed off. Too fluid, maybe, or too deliberate. That's the medical clinic. Paul pointed to a small building with a red cross painted on the door. Catherine Miles runs it. She's the closest thing to a doctor you'll find out here. What if there's a real emergency? Catherine handles most things. For anything serious, we'd have to drive to the city. Paul's tone suggested that wasn't really an option. And that's Turner's bar. Donald Turner's been here longer than anyone. The bar looked like every small-town dive I'd ever seen, except for the windows. They were tinted so dark you couldn't see inside at all. Friendly place. Donald's not much for conversation, but he's reliable. Paul checked his watch. We should head back soon. You'll want to get settled before your first shift. When does that start? Tonight. I'll be around for a few more days to show you the ropes, but you'll be flying solo pretty quickly. As we walked back to the truck, I caught a glimpse of someone watching us from an alley between 2 buildings. Just a shadow, really, but something about the way they stood made the hair on my neck stand up. When I looked again, they were gone. Paul, I said as we drove back toward the lodge, what exactly am I going to be taking care of at night? He was quiet for a long moment.
The lodge has some specialized equipment, research-related. It needs monitoring. What kind of research? The kind that pays well and asks few questions. Paul glanced at me again. That's why we hired you, Randy. Your background check showed someone who values privacy and doesn't dig too deep into things that aren't his business. That stung a little, mostly because it was accurate. My journalism career had ended precisely because I dug too deep into the wrong things. Now here I was, accepting a job specifically because I'd learned not to ask questions. Just remember, Paul said as the lodge came into view, follow the rules, do the work, collect the paycheck. Everything else will take care of itself. The envelope of rules felt heavier in my pocket. Whatever I'd gotten myself into, I was about to discover just how deep it went. I pulled the envelope from my pocket the moment Paul's truck vanished down the road. The paper felt expensive, heavy stock that crinkled when I unfolded it. At the top, in neat block letters, Lodge Operational Guidelines, Mandatory Compliance. What followed was 23 pages of the most paranoid material I'd ever read. Rule number 1. Lodge doors remain locked from sunset to sunrise. No exceptions. Rule number 2. Do not respond to knocking, calling, or any sounds from outside during night hours. Rule number 3. Basement level access is restricted. Door remains locked at all times. Rule number 4. Second floor east wing is off limits. Room 7 stays locked. Rule number 5. Kitchen windows must be covered before dark. It went on like that. Don't use the radio after 10 p.m. Don't shine lights toward the tree line. Don't leave food outside. Don't.
Rule number 18 made me stop reading entirely. If townspeople appear to be injured or in distress during night hours, do not provide assistance. Contact morning supervisor immediately. What kind of place writes rules about not helping injured people? I was about to find out. What kind of place had rules about not helping injured people? I set the papers down and walked to the kitchen window. The sun was sinking low, painting the trees in shades of orange that should have been beautiful, but somehow felt ominous instead. Following the rules, I pulled down the heavy curtains Paul had shown me earlier. The fabric was thick, almost like blackout material, and once it was in place, the kitchen felt like a cave. The silence hit me then. No traffic, no neighbors, no city sounds at all. Just the lodge settling around me and the distant whisper of wind through trees. I'd wanted isolation, but this felt different. This felt like being buried alive. I went back to the rules. Rule number 23. Previous employees' belongings in storage closet are not to be disturbed or removed from premises. That was new information. Paul hadn't mentioned a storage closet, and he definitely hadn't mentioned previous employees leaving things behind. People who quit jobs usually took their belongings with them. The storage closet turned out to be next to the laundry room, secured with a padlock that looked newer than everything else in the lodge. Through the slats, I could see boxes, clothes hanging on a rod, what looked like a laptop bag. How many people had worked here before me? And why had they all left their belongings behind? I checked my watch. 7:30. The rules said night protocols began at sunset, which was happening right about now. Time to find out what I was really getting paid to do. The monitoring station was in what Paul had called the technical room, a space lined with screens showing feeds from cameras I hadn't noticed around the property. Most showed empty forest, but a few focused on the road leading to town and the lodge's immediate surroundings. In the center sat a desk with a logbook, a radio, and a panel of switches labeled with things like perimeter lighting and ventilation override. The logbook's most recent entry was in Paul's handwriting. Day 847,
No incidents. New employee orientation complete. Transitioning to solo operations. Day 847. That was more than 2 years. How long had Paul been doing this job? I flipped back through the pages. Different handwriting appeared every few months, always starting with Day 1 and usually ending abruptly somewhere between Day 30 and Day 90. One entry caught my attention. Day 73. They're getting more sophisticated tonight. Catherine sounded exactly like my sister. I almost opened the door. The voice modulation technology they're using is incredible, but I have to remember it's not real. None of this is real. Voice modulation technology. I flipped forward, looking for more entries from the same person. Day 81. Found scratches around the basement door again. Whatever they're using to make those marks is getting more realistic. Paul says it's all part of the psychological conditioning, but it's hard to remember that at 3 a.m. when you're hearing your dead mother calling your name. The entries stopped there. The next page started over with Day 1 in different handwriting. Every person who sat in this chair before me stopped writing eventually. Not one of them explained why. I closed the logbook and stared at the monitors. The cameras showed nothing but empty forest and the dark road. Whatever these previous employees had been writing about, it wasn't happening tonight. Maybe Paul had been right about them not following the rules. Maybe they'd let their imaginations run wild in the isolation. Or maybe I was about to find out why the job paid so well. The radio crackled to life, making me jump. Paul's voice came through clear and steady. "Randy, you there?" I grabbed the handset. "Yeah, I'm here. How are you settling in?" "Fine, just reading through the rules." I hesitated. "Paul, some of these seem pretty extreme. What exactly am I protecting the lodge from?" Static filled the silence for a moment. "Randy, I need you to understand something. The people in town, they're not quite what they seem. The research facility has been working with them for a long time, and some of the treatments have had side effects." "What kind of side effects?" "Behavioral changes, physical changes. They're not dangerous exactly, but they can be unpredictable, especially at night." I stared at the monitors, remembering the woman in the general store whose eyes had reflected light. "What kind of research?" "Medical research. Genetic therapy trials. The kind of cutting-edge work that requires isolated test populations."
Paul's voice was getting fainter, like he was driving away from his radio. "The important thing is that you follow the protocols. The rules exist because previous employees didn't take them seriously." "What happened to them?" The radio went quiet for so long I thought I'd lost the signal. When Paul's voice came back, it was barely audible. "They made mistakes, Randy. Don't make mistakes." The transmission cut out, leaving me alone with the hum of electronics and the weight of 23 pages of rules that were starting to feel less like paranoia and more like a survival guide. I settled into the desk chair and opened the logbook to a fresh page. In my neatest handwriting, I wrote, Day 1, night shift begins. All systems normal. Outside, something howled in the distance. It might have been a coyote, but it lasted too long and had too many harmonics, like multiple voices singing together. I added to my log entry, unusual wildlife sounds noted. Investigating not recommended per operational guidelines. The monitors showed nothing but darkness and trees. Whatever was out there, the cameras couldn't see it. Or maybe they weren't supposed to. I pulled the rules closer and started reading them again, more carefully this time, because something told me that before this job was over, I was going to need to know every single one by heart. The first thing I learned about working alone at the lodge was how loud silence could be. Without Paul's constant commentary, every creak of the building sounded like footsteps, every gust of wind like whispers. I'd been making my rounds for 3 hours, checking the monitoring station, testing the radio, familiarizing myself with the labyrinth of hallways that seemed to multiply in the dark. The maintenance routine was straightforward enough. Check the generators, monitor the camera feeds, log any unusual activity. The cameras showed the same empty forest they'd shown the night before and the night before that. Just trees and shadows and the occasional deer wandering through the frame. I was starting to think maybe the previous workers had just cracked under the isolation when the knocking started. Soft at first, 3 gentle raps on the front door, the kind a neighbor might make when they didn't want to wake anyone. I froze at the monitoring desk, staring at the screen that showed the front porch. A woman stood there in a white nurse's uniform, her auburn hair catching the porch light. Catherine Miles. Her uniform was torn across the shoulder, dark stains spreading down the front that could only be blood. She knocked again, more urgently this time. "Hello? Is anyone there? I've been in an accident." Her voice carried clearly through the thick walls. "Please, I need help." I remembered rule number 2. Do not respond to knocking, calling, or any sounds from outside during night hours. But this was different, wasn't it? This was someone actually hurt, not some psychological test or training exercise. Catherine pressed her face against the window beside the door, cupping her hands around her eyes to peer inside. "I know someone's in there. The lights are on. Please, I'm bleeding pretty badly here." My hand moved toward the door controls before I caught myself. Paul's warnings echoed in my head. Never help them. Never open the door. But looking at Catherine's pale face through the glass, seeing the genuine pain in her expression, every decent instinct I had was screaming at me to help her. "My car went off the road about a mile from here," she called out, her voice getting weaker. "I think I have a concussion. I just need to use your phone to call for help." I stayed frozen at the monitoring station, watching her through the camera feed. She looked exactly like the woman I'd met briefly in town. Same face, same hair, same general build. But something about her movements seemed off. Too fluid, maybe. Too controlled for someone who'd supposedly just been in a car accident. "Please," she said, and her voice cracked with what sounded like genuine desperation. "I'm scared. There's something wrong with my vision. Everything looks strange." Every part of me wanted to open that door. Every rule told me not to. One of those instincts was going to get me killed. That almost got me, the raw fear in her voice, the way she touched her forehead like she was checking for injuries. But I forced myself to stay in the chair, to remember that Paul had specifically warned me about this exact scenario. Catherine stepped back from the window and looked directly up at the camera. For a moment, her eyes seemed to reflect the infrared light like an animal's. Then she smiled, and I saw that her teeth looked different, sharper.
"I know you're watching me," she said, her voice changing, getting deeper, more guttural. "I can hear your heartbeat from here." The hair on my neck stood up. That wasn't possible. The walls were too thick and she was too far away. Unless she was using some kind of listening device, some piece of technology that could pick up sounds through the building structure. Catherine began walking around the lodge's perimeter, staying just within range of the cameras. Her movements had changed completely. Where before she'd seemed injured and desperate, now she moved with predatory grace. Each step was perfectly placed, silent, despite her white nursing shoes. "You can't stay in there forever," she called out, her voice now carrying an electronic undertone that definitely sounded like voice modulation equipment. "Eventually you'll have to come out. Eventually you'll make a mistake." She stopped at each window, pressing her hands against the glass and peering inside. Her fingernails, I noticed, were longer than they should be. Not impossibly long, but filed to points that caught the light. "The last one lasted 3 months," she said conversationally, as if we were having a normal chat. "He was stubborn too, followed all the rules, just like you're doing now. But everyone breaks eventually." I gripped the edge of the desk, forcing myself to stay calm. This was obviously some kind of test. Paul had mentioned psychological conditioning, and this had to be part of it. Catherine was probably wearing some kind of costume, using props and technology to create the illusion of something supernatural. But knowing it was manufactured didn't make it less terrifying. "His name was Marcus," Catherine continued, now at the kitchen window. "Sweet boy. Reminded me of my younger brother. He lasted until day 87 before he opened the door." She pressed her face against the glass, her breath fogging the window. "Want to know what happened to him?" I didn't want to know. I really, really didn't want to know. Catherine's laugh was like shattered glass. "He's still here, in a way. Part of the community now. Part of the family." For the next hour, she circled the lodge like a shark. Sometimes she'd disappear from the cameras entirely, only to reappear at a different window. Sometimes she'd stand perfectly still for 10 or 15 minutes, just staring at the building. And sometimes she'd talk, her voice shifting between the concerned nurse I'd met in town and something else entirely. The worst part was how normal she looked. If you ignored the predatory movements and the electronic undertone to her voice, she could have been any medical professional making house calls. The blood on her uniform looked real. The concern in her expression, when she let it show, seemed genuine. Around 2 in the morning, she simply walked away. One moment she was at the front door, the next she was gone. The cameras showed empty forest, empty road, empty everything. I sat in the monitoring chair until dawn, jumping at every sound, checking and rechecking the camera feeds. When the sun finally came up, I felt like I'd aged about 10 years. The radio crackled to life at 7 a.m. "Randy, you there?" Paul's voice had never sounded so welcome. "Yeah, I'm here." "How was your first solo night?" I looked at the logbook where I'd been documenting everything. "Eventful. Catherine Miles showed up around midnight. Said she'd been in an accident. I followed the rules. Didn't open the door." "Good man." Paul sounded genuinely pleased. "What did you think of her performance?" Performance. So it had been a test. Pretty convincing. The voice modulation technology was impressive. Paul was quiet for a moment. Voice modulation? Yeah, the way her voice changed. Got deeper, more electronic sounding. And the way she moved, like she'd been trained for it. Right, training. Paul's tone was strange. "I'll be back in a few hours. We need to talk." The radio went dead, leaving me alone with questions I wasn't sure I wanted answered. At 9 a.m., I called the medical clinic. Catherine answered on the second ring, her voice bright and cheerful. "Miles Medical, this is Catherine." "Hi, this is Randy from the lodge. I just wanted to check. Were you okay last night? No accidents or anything?" She laughed, a completely normal sound. "Accidents? No, I was home all evening. Had an early dinner and went to bed around 9. Why do you ask?" "No reason, just checking on everyone." "That's sweet of you. How are you settling in up there? Fine. Just fine.
After I hung up, I sat staring at the phone. Either Catherine was lying, or whoever had been at the lodge last night wasn't Catherine at all. But the cameras didn't lie, and the woman I'd seen had looked exactly like her. Asterisk, she said she was home asleep. The cameras said otherwise. One of them was lying, and I wasn't sure which answer scared me more. Asterisk. Paul returned around noon, carrying grocery bags and wearing the same business casual outfit that seemed so out of place in the wilderness. He found me in the kitchen, staring out the window at the spot where Catherine had stood. "You look like hell," he said. "Didn't sleep much." Paul set down the groceries and studied my face. "Tell me exactly what happened." Every detail. I walked him through the entire night, from the first knock to Catherine's disappearance. Paul listened without interrupting, his expression growing more serious with each detail. "You did well," he said when I finished. "Better than most. The previous night worker lasted 3 months before making a mistake." Paul opened one of the grocery bags, pulling out canned goods. "His name was Marcus. Good kid. Followed the rules religiously until the night he didn't." "What happened?" "He opened the door." Paul's voice was matter-of-fact. "Someone was outside claiming to be hurt. Okay, let his compassion override his training. And then," Paul looked at me for a long moment. "Then he wasn't a good fit anymore." The way he said it made my stomach drop. "What does that mean, exactly?" Instead of answering, Paul walked to a door I'd noticed but never opened. It was next to the laundry room, secured with a padlock that looked newer than everything else in the lodge. "Previous employees' belongings," Paul said, producing a key. "The ones who didn't work out." The closet was bigger than I'd expected, lined with shelves and hanging rods. Boxes were stacked floor to ceiling, each labeled with a name and dates. Asterisk Marcus Chin, February-May 2023. Asterisk Sarah Williams, August-October 2022. Asterisk David Rodriguez, March-April 2022. Asterisk. There were at least a dozen boxes, some dating back years. They all just left their stuff behind. They all made mistakes. Paul pulled down a box labeled asterisk Marcus Chin asterisk and opened it. Q. Inside were clothes, a laptop, personal photos, a wallet with credit cards still inside. Marcus was particularly stubborn, kept a journal documenting everything. He handed me a small notebook. The early entries were normal enough: complaints about isolation, observations about the peculiar townspeople, questions about the job's real purpose. But as the dates progressed, the handwriting became more frantic. Asterisk, day 45. Catherine came again last night. This time, she sounded exactly like my ex-wife. How do they know these things about my personal life? Asterisk, day 52. The voice technology is getting more sophisticated. Tonight, Donald Turner called out in my father's voice. Dad's been dead for 5 years. Asterisk, day 67. I'm starting to think this isn't technology at all. The way they move, the way their eyes reflect light, something's not right here. Asterisk, day 73. They're getting more sophisticated. Tonight, Catherine sounded exactly like my sister. I almost opened the door. The voice modulation technology they're using is incredible, but I have to remember it's not real. None of this is real. Asterisk, day 81. Found scratches around the basement door again. Whatever they're using to make those marks is getting more realistic. Paul says it's all part of the psychological conditioning, but it's hard to remember that at 3 a.m. when you're hearing your dead mother calling your name. Asterisk, the entries stopped there. The next page was blank. What happened to him? I asked. Paul took the journal back and returned it to the box. He stopped following the rules, started believing his own theories about what was happening here. And then, Henty made a mistake. Paul closed the box and put it back on the shelf. Randy, I need you to understand something. This job isn't just about monitoring equipment or doing maintenance. It's about learning to distinguish between what's real and what's not, between what you can trust and what you can't. I stared at the rows of boxes, each representing someone who'd failed some test I didn't fully understand. What exactly am I being tested for? Paul locked the closet and pocketed the key. Adaptability, resilience, the ability to follow instructions even when they don't make sense. He looked at me seriously. The people in town, they're not what they seem, but they're not what Marcus thought they were either. The truth is somewhere in between, and finding that balance is what this job is really about. And if I can't find that balance, Paul gestured toward the closet, then you'll join the collection. That night, I sat at the monitoring station with Marcus's journal entries echoing in my head. The cameras showed the same empty forest, the same dark road. Now, I knew that somewhere out there, Catherine Miles was probably preparing for another performance, another test of my resolve. I opened the logbook to a fresh page and wrote, Asterisk, Day 2. Psychological conditioning protocols initiated. Subject, maintaining compliance with operational guidelines. Asterisk, then I crossed it out and wrote something simpler. Asterisk, Day 2. Still following the rules. Asterisk. Outside, something moved between the trees. Just a shadow, but it was walking upright, walking toward the lodge. I turned up the radio and settled in for another long night. I grabbed the lodge's keys and headed for my car before I could talk myself out of it. Paul had left for another supply run, and I needed answers that weren't coming from operational guidelines or cryptic radio conversations. The drive to town felt different in daylight. Less ominous, more normal. It's just a winding road through pine trees, leading to a cluster of buildings that could have been any small mountain community. But I kept thinking about Catherine's performance the night before, how she'd moved like something hunting. Turner's Bar sat at the edge of town, a squat building with dark windows and a neon sign that flickered even in broad daylight. The kind of place that looked like it had been serving the same 6 customers for the past 20 years. The interior was exactly what I expected. Dim lighting, worn wooden floors, the smell of stale beer and cigarettes. What I didn't expect was how the conversations died the moment I walked in. 4 people sat at the bar nursing drinks and staring at me with the kind of focused attention that made my skin crawl. Their fingernails caught the light from the beer signs, filed 2 points that were just sharp enough to notice. One woman turned her head to track my movement, and I caught that same reflective quality in her eyes that I'd seen in Catherine. You must be the new lodge fellow. The bartender was a big man with graying hair and shoulders that belonged on a linebacker. Donald Turner, according to the name tag pinned to his black shirt. Paul said you might stop by. Just wanted to grab a beer. See the town? Donald pulled a bottle from the cooler and set it in front of me. His movements were too smooth, too controlled, like Catherine's had been, but more subtle. Most lodge workers don't make it into town much, especially after their first few nights. Why is that? Schedule's demanding. Night work takes adjustment. Donald's smile showed teeth that seemed slightly too sharp. How are you adjusting? I took a sip of beer and tried to look casual. Fine so far. It's quiet up there. One of the patrons laughed, a sound like gravel in a blender. Quiet. That's good. Marcus used to say the same thing. Another added. Right up until he didn't. Donald shot them a look that shut them up immediately. Marcus had trouble following instructions. You seem smarter than that. What happened to him? Found a better opportunity. Donald wiped down the bar with movements that were just a little too fluid. Most people do, eventually. Lodge work isn't for everyone. I finished my beer faster than I'd planned and left money on the bar. The patrons watched me go, their heads turning in unison like they were choreographed. The general store was my next stop, a cramped space packed with everything from groceries to fishing gear. The woman behind the counter looked up when I entered, and for a moment I thought I was seeing things. Her eyes were completely normal. No reflective quality, no predatory gleam. Just regular brown eyes and a face that couldn't have been older than 25. "You're from the lodge," she said, and her voice held genuine warmth instead of the electronic undertones I was getting used to. "I'm Lily, Randy. Nice to meet someone who doesn't look at me like I'm dinner." Lily glanced toward the windows, then moved closer. "You should be careful saying things like that. They don't like jokes about their condition. Their condition. The changes, they're more pronounced at night, but they're always there." She kept her voice low, barely above a whisper. "How long have you been at the lodge?" 3 days, and you're already in town alone." Lily looked genuinely worried. "Most people don't venture out until they've been there at least a week. Paul usually keeps new workers isolated longer. Paul's been pretty hands-off, says I'm adapting well." Something flickered across Lily's face. Fear. Maybe that's not necessarily good, okay? The ones who adapt quickly are the ones they keep. Keep for what? Asterisk, asterisk. Lily's next words changed everything I thought I knew about this place. Asterisk, asterisk. Before Lily could answer, the store's bell chimed. Catherine Miles walked in, wearing the same white nurse's uniform I'd seen her in the night before, except now it was clean, pressed, completely free of the bloodstains that had covered it during her performance. Lily's entire demeanor changed. Her shoulders hunched, her eyes dropped to the floor, and she stepped back behind the counter like she was trying to disappear. "Randy," Catherine said, her voice bright and cheerful. "How nice to see you in town. How are you settling in?" "Fine, thanks." I watched Lily from the corner of my eye. She was gripping the counter edge so hard her knuckles were white. The first week is always the hardest. So many adjustments to make. Catherine moved through the store like she owned it, picking up items and setting them down without really looking at them. Cool. But everyone finds their place eventually. Don't they, Lily? "Yes, ma'am." Lily's voice was barely audible. "Lily's been with us for almost a year now, haven't you, dear?" "Yes, ma'am." Catherine turned back to me, and I caught a glimpse of those sharpened teeth when she smiled. She's learned to appreciate the benefits of community life, the sense of belonging, the security. "Sounds nice," I said, though nothing about this felt nice. "Oh, it is. Once you understand how things work here, it becomes quite comfortable. Natural even." Catherine's eyes held mine for a moment too long. "Paul tells me you're progressing well with your adjustment period. I'm just following the rules." "Good. The rules exist for everyone's protection." She moved toward the door, then paused. "Lily, don't forget what we discussed about your departure timeline." Lily nodded without looking up. Catherine left, and the store felt like someone had opened a window after hours of stale air. "Departure timeline?" I asked. Lily waited until Catherine's footsteps faded before speaking. "I'm supposed to be leaving town soon, moving to another facility." "Another facility?" The lodge isn't the only one. There are others scattered around the country. People get transferred between them based on their progress." Lily finally looked at me, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Randy, you need to understand something. The lodge doesn't just monitor things. It processes people." "What does that mean?" "Okay, it changes them gradually, so they don't notice at first. The air filtration system, the food, even the water, everything's designed to prepare workers for integration into the community." My stomach dropped. Integration. The townspeople weren't always like this, okay? They were lodge workers once, or volunteers from other programs, okay? The modifications happen slowly, over months. By the time people realize what's happening, they're too changed to leave. I thought about my improved night vision, my increased stamina, things I'd attributed to adapting to the job. How long does it take? Depends on the person. Some fight it longer than others. Lily glanced toward the window again. Marcus lasted 3 months before they moved him to the final stage. Paul said Marcus made a mistake, that he didn't follow the rules. Marcus tried to escape. When that didn't work, he tried to warn the next worker. Lily's voice was getting smaller. That's when they decided he was ready for full integration. Where is he now? Still here, as part of the community. Lily wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. You've probably seen him during your night shifts. He's one of the ones who circles the lodge. The room started spinning. One of the figures I'd seen moving between the trees. One of the voices calling out in the darkness. That was Marcus, the previous lodge worker who'd left behind a box of belongings and a journal full of increasingly frantic observations. Why are you telling me this? Because you seem different. Most people who adapt quickly to the lodge are already broken somehow, already looking for a place to disappear. Lily studied my face. But you're not broken. You're just running from something. She was right. I was running from my failed career, my dead mother, my complete inability to fix anything in my life. But I wasn't ready to disappear entirely. What about you? How are you different? I volunteered for the program, thought I was helping with medical research. Lily's laugh was bitter. Turns out I was just helping them perfect their techniques. But the modifications didn't take the way they expected. I retained too much of my original personality. Is that why you're being transferred? That's why I'm being eliminated. The words came out flat. Matter of fact, the transfer story is for your benefit, to make you think there's still a way out. I stared at her, this young woman who was calmly discussing her own death sentence. We have to get you out of here. There's nowhere to go, okay? The facility has resources you can't imagine. And even if I could escape, I'm all ready to change to survive in the outside world. Lily touched her throat, and I noticed faint scars along her neck. The modifications aren't just cosmetic. The store's bell chimed again. Through the window, I could see several townspeople gathering on the street, not doing anything threatening, just standing there watching. You should go, Lily said. They don't like it when new workers spend too much time with me. I wanted to argue, to insist that we figure out a plan together, but the growing crowd outside made it clear that staying would only make things worse for both of us. Is there anything I can do? Follow the rules. Don't let them know you're aware of what's really happening. Lily managed a small smile. And don't trust Paul completely. He's not what he seems, either. I left the store with my head spinning and a growing sense that I'd walked into something much bigger than a simple caretaking job. The townspeople watched me get into my car, their faces pressed against windows with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Some of them followed my progress down the street, moving from window to window to keep me in sight. The drive back to the lodge felt like fleeing a crime scene. Paul was waiting when I got back, unloading groceries from his truck with the same methodical precision he brought to everything else. He found me in the kitchen, staring out the window at the spot where Catherine had stood. How was town? He asked. Interesting. Met some of the locals. And what did you think? Chose my words carefully. They seemed very invested in the lodge's operations. Paul nodded approvingly. The community takes the research very seriously. Everyone has a role to play. What kind of research, exactly? Adaptive biology, human enhancement. The kind of work that requires isolated populations and controlled environments. Paul carried a box of supplies toward the lodge. The underground facilities house most of the equipment. You'll see them eventually, once you've proven yourself reliable. When would that be? Soon. Most workers are ready for expanded access within their first month. Paul paused at the door, assuming they demonstrate commitment to staying permanently. That night, I sat at the monitoring station with Lily's warnings echoing in my head. The cameras showed the same empty forest, but now I knew that somewhere in those trees, Marcus was probably preparing for another performance, another test of my resolve. Except it wasn't really a test anymore. It was conditioning, gradual exposure designed to make the abnormal seem normal, to prepare me for changes I might not even notice until they were irreversible. I opened the logbook and stared at the blank page for a long time before writing. Asterisk, day 4. Community integration proceeding as expected. Asterisk. Then I crossed it out and wrote, asterisk, day 4. Beginning to understand the real job requirements. Asterisk outside. Something howled in the distance. It might have been Marcus or Catherine or any of the other former lodge workers who'd found their place in the community. I was starting to think I had less time than I'd hoped to decide whether I wanted to join them. The voices started around midnight, but they weren't coming from the usual suspects. I was doing my routine check of the camera feeds when I heard Sarah calling my name from outside the front door. Not someone pretending to be Sarah. This was her actual voice. It's down to the slight rasp she got when she was upset, and the way she pronounced my name like it had too many syllables. Randy, please. I know you're in there. Her voice carried that particular tone she used when she was trying not to cry. I drove all the way out here to find you. My hand froze over the radio controls. Sarah was my ex-girlfriend, the one I lost when my journalism career imploded. She lived in Phoenix, had no idea where I'd gone, and definitely wouldn't drive 8 hours into the mountains to track me down. So hearing her voice made my chest tight in ways I wasn't prepared for. Through the front door camera, I could see Donald Turner standing on the porch. Big guy, lying back her shoulders, wearing the same black shirt I'd seen him in at the bar. But when he opened his mouth, Sarah's voice came out. I know I said things, terrible things, but I was scared, Randy. Scared of what you were becoming, how obsessed you got with that story. Asterisk, asterisk. They weren't just imitating voices anymore. They were weaponizing my memories. Asterisk, asterisk. The voice modulation was perfect. Not just the tone and inflection, but the emotional undertones that made Sarah sound exactly like she had during our last fight. I should have supported you instead of running away. I gripped the edge of the monitoring desk. This was just another test, another psychological conditioning exercise. But knowing that didn't make it easier to hear Sarah's voice apologizing for things that had actually happened, using words I'd imagined her saying 1,000 times during sleepless nights. I brought your things, the stuff you left at my apartment. Donald held up a cardboard box, and even though I knew it was fake, part of me wondered what was inside. Your coffee mug with a chip in the handle. That stupid journalism award you were so proud of. The photo of your mom from her birthday. That last detail hit like a punch to the stomach. Sarah had been there for Mom's final birthday. Had helped me pick out the frame for that photo. How could they possibly know about something so specific? Movement on the side cameras caught my attention. Catherine Miles was walking around the lodge's perimeter, but she wasn't alone. 3 other townspeople moved with her, all of them circling the building like they were performing some kind of ritual. Then Catherine started talking, and I heard my mother's voice. Mijo, why won't you come home? The words came out in Mom's exact accent, the way she mixed English and Spanish when she was worried. I'm so tired, Randy. So tired of waiting for you to forgive me. I actually stood up from the chair. Mom had been dead for 2 years, and our last conversation had been a fight about my career, about how I was throwing my life away, chasing conspiracy theories instead of finding a stable job. She died while we were still angry at each other, and I'd never gotten a chance to apologize. I know I said you were wasting your education. I know I didn't understand what you were trying to do. Catherine's voice carried. Mom's particular way of getting emotional, the slight tremor that meant she was about to cry. I was proud of you, Mijo. Even when I was angry, I was proud. My vision blurred. These were the words I needed to hear, the conversation I'd replayed in my head every night since the funeral. But they were coming from Catherine Miles, a woman who'd been circling the lodge like a predator just 3 nights ago. The third voice hit me from the back of the building. My father, dead for 5 years, speaking through one of the other townspeople. You always were too stubborn for your own good. Dad's voice carried his usual mix of affection and exasperation, just like your old man. but sometimes being stubborn is what keeps you alive. I moved between the camera feeds, watching for different people speaking voices from my past. The technology was incredible. It's not just the vocal mimicry, but the emotional authenticity. They weren't just copying sounds. They were recreating the specific ways these people had talked to me, the private jokes and personal references that no recording could capture. "We miss you," Sarah's voice continued from the front door. "Everyone misses you. Even the people at the paper ask about you sometimes. Come home, mijo," Mom's voice pleaded from the side yard. "Come home and we'll figure everything out together. You don't have to carry this alone," Dad's voice added from the back. "Whatever you're running from, we can face it as a family." For almost an hour. They kept it up, taking turns, sometimes overlapping, creating a chorus of voices from my past, all begging me to open the door and come outside. They knew details that should have been impossible. Inside jokes with Sarah, specific arguments with my parents, even the exact words Mom had used during our last phone call. But the longer it went on, the more wrong it felt. Not the voices themselves, which remained perfect, but the things they were saying. Sarah apologizing without conditions. Mom admitting she'd been wrong about my career. Dad offering emotional support instead of practical advice. These were the conversations I had wanted asterisk to have, not the ones that had actually happened. Around 2 a.m., the voices changed tactics. Instead of pleading, they started sharing memories. Happy ones, mostly. Sarah talking about our first date. Mom describing my college graduation. Dad reminiscing about teaching me to drive. But mixed in were details that felt too intimate, too private. "Remember that night you cried after your first article got rejected?" Sarah's voice drifted through the walls. "You thought your career was over before it started? I held you until you fell asleep. You used to have nightmares about not being good enough," Mom's voice added. "Even as a little boy, you'd wake up worried that you'd disappointed someone. That's why you became a journalist," Dad's voice concluded. "You wanted to prove you could uncover the truth." Even when everyone else gave up, they were building a psychological profile in real time, using my own memories against me. But how could they know these things? Even if they'd somehow accessed my personal records, my employment history, my social media, none of that would contain the kind of intimate details they were using. Unless they'd been watching me longer than I realized. Around 3 a.m., the voices stopped. The cameras showed empty forest, empty road, empty everything. But I could hear movement below me, coming from somewhere underneath the lodge. It's a basement. I'd never been down there. The rules didn't explicitly forbid it, but Paul had never mentioned it during his tour, and I'd assumed it was just storage space or mechanical equipment. Now I could hear scratching sounds, like something with claws trying to dig through metal. I grabbed a flashlight and headed for the basement door, which I found next to the laundry room. It was unlocked, opening onto a narrow staircase that descended into darkness. The scratching sounds got louder as I went down. The basement was nothing like the rest of the lodge. Instead of rustic wood and stone, everything was steel and concrete. Industrial lighting hung from the ceiling, currently dark. Ventilation systems hummed along the walls, and I could smell something chemical in the air. Antiseptic, maybe, or some kind of cleaning solution. At the far end of the basement was a door that didn't belong in any normal building. Heavy steel, marked with biohazard symbols and warning signs in English, Spanish, and what looked like Russian. The scratching sounds were coming from the other side. I approached carefully, its flashlight beam dancing across warning labels that mentioned contamination protocols and authorized personnel only. There was a small window in the door, but it was covered from the inside with what looked like metal sheeting. The scratching stopped. Then I heard breathing, slow, deliberate, like something large, trying to stay quiet. It was definitely coming from behind the steel door, but the sound seemed wrong somehow. It's too controlled, too rhythmic. Voice spoke from the other side of the door. My own voice. "You shouldn't be down here, Andy." It was perfect. My exact tone, my speech patterns, even the slight hesitation I got when I was nervous. This area is off limits for a reason. No one's down here, Randy. My voice sounded patient, like I was explaining something obvious. You're talking to yourself. The isolation is getting to you, just like it got to Marcus. The breathing sounds resumed. But now they seem to be coming from multiple sources, like several people were standing behind the door, all breathing in unison. I backed toward the stairs, keeping the flashlight trained on the steel door. The biohazard symbols seemed to glow in the beam, and I noticed details I'd missed before, dates on some of the warning labels going back years, modification notices suggesting the containment protocols had been updated multiple times. You should go back upstairs, my voice suggested from behind the door. Continue your monitoring duties. Pretend you never came down here. Instead, I moved closer to examine the ventilation systems. They were more sophisticated than anything the lodge should need. Multiple filtration stages and what looked like chemical processing equipment. Pipes ran from the basement systems up through the walls, probably connecting to the air circulation throughout the building. Whatever was behind that steel door, it was connected to the lodge's life support systems. I climbed back upstairs and returned to the monitoring station, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed. The townspeople's performance had been disturbing enough, but finding that basement facility suggested the lodge was more than just a monitoring station. At dawn, the scratching sound stopped. The cameras showed the townspeople walking away from the lodge, moving back toward town with the same fluid grace I'd noticed before. But now I could see deep gouges in the lodge's exterior walls, claw marks that looked fresh. Paul returned around 8 a.m., carrying his usual grocery bags and wearing his usual business casual outfit. But when he saw my face, his expression grew serious. Rough night. They used voices, people from my past. I gestured toward the cameras. How could they know those details? Research is thorough here. Background checks, psychological profiles, social media analysis. Paul set down the groceries and studied the claw marks on the nearest window. They're getting more sophisticated. I went to the basement. Paul froze. What did you find? A steel door with biohazard warnings. Something was behind it, breathing, talking in my voice. Paul was quiet for a long moment, staring at the claw marks. The basement contains specialized research equipment. Some of it is experimental. What kind of experiments? The kind that require isolated test populations and controlled environments. Paul looked at me directly. Randy, I need to tell you something about Lily Sawyer. My stomach dropped. What about her? She's gone. Left town sometime during the night. Paul's tone was carefully neutral. Her departure was expected. Expected how? People who ask too many questions, who try to interfere with the research protocols, they don't tend to stay long. Paul picked up the grocery bags again. The community has ways of dealing with disruptions. I thought about Lily's warnings, her fear when Catherine had entered the store. What happened to her? She found a better opportunity, just like Marcus, just like all the others who weren't a good fit. Headed toward the lodge entrance. Randy, we need to discuss your integration timeline. Your training period is progressing faster than most previous workers. Integration into what? Paul paused at the door. Into the community. Into the research program. Into your permanent role here. He looked back at me with something that might have been sympathy. The psychological conditioning phase is almost complete. Soon you'll be ready for the next stage. That night, I sat at the monitoring station with a growing certainty that my time as an observer was running out. The basement facility, the sophisticated voice technology, the townspeople's increasing boldness. Everything pointed towards some kind of escalation. I opened the logbook and wrote, Asterisk, Day 5. Basement facility discovered. Psychological conditioning intensifying. Subject approaching readiness for next phase. Asterisk. Then I crossed it out and wrote something simpler. Asterisk, Day 5. Running out of time. Asterisk outside. The forest was quiet, but I knew that somewhere in those trees, the townspeople were preparing for whatever came next. It's cut, and somewhere behind that steel door in the basement, something was waiting for me to join it. I was starting to think I didn't have much choice in the matter. Paul was waiting for me in the kitchen when I came downstairs, but something was wrong with his face. Not obviously wrong. If I'd glanced at him quickly, I might not have noticed. But I've been studying people's faces for days now, looking for the telltale signs of modification, and Paul's features had shifted since yesterday. His canine teeth were more pronounced when he spoke, catching the light in ways they hadn't before. His movements had that same fluid quality I'd noticed in the townspeople, like his joints had been oiled overnight. Sleep well? He asked, pouring coffee with hands that seemed steadier than any humans should be after the night we'd had. Not really. I accepted the mug and watched his eyes. In the morning light streaming through the kitchen window, they held just the faintest reflective quality. Paul, we need to talk. About what? About what's really happening here. About the townspeople, the basement facility, all of it. I set down my coffee without drinking it. I'm done pretending this is normal. Paul was quiet for a long moment, studying my face the same way I've been studying his. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weariness I hadn't heard before. What do you think is happening here, Randy? I think the townspeople aren't what they appear to be. I think this lodge is more than a monitoring station. I think you've been lying to me since the moment I arrived. Paul laughed, but it came out wrong. Too many harmonics, like multiple voices layering together. You're right about all of that. The question is whether you're ready to hear the truth. Try me. Paul moved to the window and looked out toward town. In profile, I could see that his jaw had changed shape slightly, becoming more angular. The research facility has been operating for 15 years. Officially, they study adaptive biology and human enhancement. Unofficially, they've been conducting illegal human experimentation on unwilling subjects, the townspeople. Some of them, others, volunteered initially before they understood what the process actually involved. Paul turned back to me, and I caught a glimpse of something metallic glinting behind his molars. The modifications aren't genetic, Randy. They're surgical, prosthetic enhancements designed to create the appearance of biological transformation. My stomach dropped. Prosthetic dental implants to sharpen teeth, surgical alterations to bone structure, reflective contact lenses, voice modulation devices implanted in the throat. Paul's tone was clinical, detached. The fluid movements come from joint modifications and muscle enhancement procedures. The heightened senses are partly surgical, partly pharmaceutical. But the voices, they knew things about my past that no surgery could explain. Sophisticated psychological profiling combined with advanced voice synthesis technology. The facility has been monitoring potential recruits for months before they're hired. Social media, employment records, even surveillance of personal relationships. Paul sat down across from me. They knew about Sarah, your mother, your father, because they've been watching you long before your car broke down on that road. The room felt like it was tilting. My car didn't break down randomly. Remote electromagnetic pulse device. They disabled your vehicle at the precise location to ensure you'd have no choice but to accept help. Paul's smile revealed tall, sharpened teeth more clearly. You were selected, Randy, specifically chosen based on psychological profiles, indicating you'd adapt well to isolation and gradual conditioning. Conditioning for what? Compliance. The lodge isn't just a monitoring station, it's a processing facility. Workers are gradually exposed to the townspeople's performances, to the facility's environment. It's carefully controlled psychological pressure designed to break down resistance to authority. Paul gestured toward the basement. Materia The air filtration system has been introducing low-level compounds into your system since your first night. Detailed. Nothing harmful, just substances designed to increase suggestibility and reduce anxiety about abnormal situations. Asterisk, asterisk. Every breath I'd taken in this building had been drugging me. Every meal, every glass of water. Asterisk, asterisk. I thought about my improved stamina, my enhanced night vision, my growing acceptance of increasingly bizarre circumstances. How long does the process take? Varies by individual. Most workers are ready for the next phase within 2 to 4 weeks. Paul studied my reaction. You've been here 6 days and you're already showing excellent adaptation markers. What's the next phase? Integration into the research program. Some subjects undergo the modification procedures and join the townspeople. Others become recruiters, using their experience to help process new workers. Paul's voice remained steady, but I caught something flickering in his eyes. A few become administrators, helping to run the facility and expand the program. And if someone refuses, Paul was quiet for a moment. The facility has invested considerable resources in each recruit. Refusal isn't really an option. I stood up from the table, needing to move. What about you, Paul? How long have you been part of this? That's complicated. Paul touched his throat, and I heard a faint mechanical click. When he spoke again, his voice sounded different, more natural, less controlled. I've been working undercover for 8 months, gathering evidence of the facility's illegal activities. Undercover for whom? Federal Bioethics Investigation Unit. We receive reports about missing persons. People who'd taken remote jobs and then disappeared. Paul's hand moved to his jaw, and I heard another mechanical sound. The modifications you're seeing aren't permanent, okay? Prosthetic devices designed to help me blend in with the other administrators. Relief flooded through me, followed immediately by suspicion. Prove it. Paul reached into his mouth and removed what looked like a sophisticated dental appliance. His teeth returned to normal human proportions. He touched something behind his ear, and his eyes lost their reflective quality as he removed nearly invisible contact lenses. The voice modulation device is more complex. It's surgically implanted to maintain cover. But the physical changes are mostly theatrical. Paul's movements became more natural, less fluid. The facility's administrators needed to believe I was undergoing the same modification process as other long-term employees. How many people know the truth? Very few. Most of the townspeople believe their modifications are permanent genetic changes. Okay? The fear and isolation make them easier to control. Paul moved toward the window again. But some of them have started to suspect. Catherine, Donald, a few others. They've been asking questions. What happened to Lily? Paul's expression darkened. Lily was different. She retained too much of her original personality after the procedures. Started trying to warn new recruits. The administrators decided she was a security risk, so they killed her. They transferred her to another facility for additional conditioning. But yes, effectively, the Lily you met is gone. Paul turned back to me. Randy, I need you to understand something. The evidence I've gathered could shut down this facility and several others like it. But I need more time to document the full scope of the operation. How much more time? Days, maybe a week. The administrators are planning to accelerate your processing because you've adapted so quickly to the environment. Paul's voice carried genuine urgency. They want to move you to the modification phase before you have time to develop doubts. I thought about the basement facility, the steel door with biohazard warnings. What exactly happens during modification? Surgical procedures to implant prosthetic devices, psychological conditioning to ensure compliance, chemical treatments to enhance physical capabilities and reduce emotional resistance. Paul's clinical tone couldn't hide his disgust. The subjects are told they are being enhanced, but they're really being turned into tools for the facility's expansion. Expansion. This isn't the only location. Quote, there are facilities across the country, all running similar programs. Quote, "The goal is to create a network of modified individuals who can recruit and process new subjects without raising suspicion from law enforcement." The scope of it was staggering. How many people? Hundreds, possibly thousands. The program has been running for over a decade, and it's accelerating. Paul moved closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Randy, I need your help. The administrators trust you because you've shown such good adaptation. If you can maintain that facade for a few more days, can finish gathering the evidence needed to expose the entire network. What do you need me to do? Continue following the rules. Act like you're accepting the situation. Don't let them know you're aware of the truth." Paul handed me a small device that looked like a hearing aid. "This will block the chemical compounds in the air filtration system. Wear it when you're alone, but remove it when anyone else is around." I took the device, feeling its weight. "What about the townspeople? Are they really victims, or are they part of the conspiracy?" "Both. Some are genuine victims who've been conditioned to believe they have no choice but to participate. Others have retained enough awareness to resist, but they're trapped by their modifications and the facility's control." Paul checked his watch. "Catherine and Donald are in the first category. They know something is wrong, but they're afraid to act. Could we get them to help? Possibly, but approaching them would be extremely dangerous. The facility monitors all interactions between staff and subjects." Paul moved toward the door. "For now, focus on maintaining your cover. I'll handle the investigation." After Paul left for another supply run, I sat in the kitchen trying to process everything I'd learned. The townspeople weren't monsters. They were victims of surgical modification and psychological manipulation. The lodge wasn't just a monitoring station. It was a processing facility designed to break down recruits and prepare them for integration into an illegal research program. And I'd been specifically selected as a target. The device Paul had given me was small enough to fit completely inside my ear canal. When I inserted it, the world seemed to sharpen slightly, like a fog I hadn't noticed was lifting. How long had the facility been dosing me with compliance drugs? How much of my acceptance of the situation had been chemically induced? That evening, I sat at the monitoring station with a new understanding of what I was really watching. The cameras weren't just showing me the townspeople's performances. They were recording my reactions, documenting my psychological adaptation to increasingly abnormal stimuli. I opened the logbook and stared at the blank page for a long time. Finally, I wrote, Day 6. Subject, maintaining excellent adaptation to environmental stressors. Recommend acceleration of integration timeline. Then. I closed the book and prepared for what might be my last night as an observer rather than a participant. Outside, the townspeople were gathering again. But now I knew they weren't coming to test me. They were coming to prepare me for whatever happened next. Paul was packing when I found him in his room the next morning, folding his pressed shirts with the same methodical precision he brought to everything else. "Leaving already?" I asked from the doorway. "Tomorrow morning." He didn't look up from his suitcase. "You ready to take over operations?" Something cold settled in my stomach. Take over what operations? Paul finally met my eyes, and I saw that familiar, calculating look I'd learned to recognize. "Randy, we need to have a conversation. A real one this time." He led me downstairs to the kitchen, but instead of stopping there, continued to the basement door, the same door I'd found unlocked nights ago, the one that led to the steel barrier with biohazard warnings. "You've been down here before," Paul said, producing a key card from his wallet. "Time you saw what's really behind that door." The steel door opened with a soft hiss, revealing an airlock chamber. "Okay." Paul gestured me inside, and after a moment of pressurization, the inner door slid open onto something that definitely didn't belong under a rustic mountain lodge. The laboratory stretched out in front of us, all white surfaces and humming equipment. Monitoring stations lined the walls, their screens displaying vital signs and brain activity patterns. In the center of the room, a series of medical chairs sat empty, equipped with restraints in 4 lines. The air smelled like antiseptic, and something else, something organic and wrong. It's impressive, isn't it? Paul's voice echoed off the sterile walls. 15 years of development, and this is still one of our smaller facilities. I stared at the medical equipment, the surgical tools arranged on sterile trays, the tanks of various colored liquids connected to complex delivery systems. What is this place? Paul moved to one of the monitoring stations and pulled up a series of files. Climate change, environmental collapse, resource depletion. Humanity is facing extinction within the next century. This facility is developing the tools we'll need to survive. The screens showed medical scans, genetic sequences, surgical procedures. I recognized some of the faces in the before and after photos. It's townspeople I'd met, but looking normal, human. The modifications aren't just cosmetic. Randy, enhanced strength, improved night vision, accelerated healing, resistance to radiation and toxins. Paul's tone carried genuine enthusiasm. We're creating the next stage of human evolution by experimenting on people without their consent. Some volunteer, others are selected based on psychological profiles, indicating strong survival instincts and adaptability. Paul turned to face me. Like you, my enhanced hearing picked up the subtle mechanical sounds of the facility's life support systems, the quiet hum of computers processing data. Everything seemed sharper, more detailed than it should have been. The air filtration system in the lodge has been introducing compounds into your bloodstream since your first night. Paul continued. Low-level stimulants, adrenaline enhancers, genetic catalysts. Your improved stamina and heightened senses aren't just adaptation to night work. I thought about the device he'd given me yesterday, the one that was supposed to block chemical compounds. The real fight was just beginning. The basement corridor filled with acrid smoke as we descended, emergency lighting casting everything in hellish red. Catherine led the way with Donald behind me. Both moving with that enhanced grace I now understood came from real genetic modifications, not just theatrical performance. Control rooms through the laboratory. Catherine called back, her voice muffled by the makeshift respirator she'd fashioned from her torn uniform. Past the medical bay, the steel door to the laboratory hung open, its electronic locks disabled by whatever emergency had triggered the lockdown. Inside, the pristine white surfaces were stained with chemical residue, and several monitoring stations sparked with electrical damage. The medical chairs sat empty, but I could see fresh restraint marks on the leather. How many people went through here? I breathed, taking in the full scope of the facility. More than you want to know, Donald said grimly, checking his watch. 8 minutes until full gas release. We pushed deeper into the laboratory, past surgical equipment and tanks of colored liquids that bubbled ominously. The chemical smell was overwhelming now, burning my throat despite my enhanced constitution. Whatever they'd been producing down here had gone seriously wrong. That's when Paul stepped out from behind a bank of computers. He looked different. Not the calculated authority figure from upstairs, but someone who'd been running on adrenaline in desperation for too long. His pressed shirt was torn, his face streaked with sweat and something that might have been blood. You shouldn't be down here, he said. But his voice carried relief instead of anger. Neither should you, Catherine shot back. Thought you evacuated with the other administrators. Paul's laugh came out bitter and exhausted. Not an administrator, Catherine. Never was. Donald raised his key card like a weapon. More lies? No more lies. Paul moved to one of the undamaged computer terminals and began typing rapidly. I've been sabotaging this place for 8 months. It's documenting everything, gathering evidence. He pulled up encrypted files. The emergency lockdown. That was me. I stared at him, trying to reconcile this with everything he'd told me. He said you were a recruiter. I was, but not by choice. Paul's fingers flew across the keyboard, uploading files to external servers. They processed me through here 3 years ago, Randy. Same genetic modifications you're experiencing now. Enhanced strength, improved reflexes, accelerated healing. But your teeth, the voice modulation, prosthetics, theater. Paul touched his throat, and I heard that mechanical click again. The real modifications are internal. Cellular regeneration, muscle density, neural processing speed. The visible changes are just for show, to maintain the deception. Catherine moved closer to the terminal, watching the upload progress. How long have you been working against them? Since I figured out what they'd really done to me. They told me I was volunteering for medical research to help my wife's condition. Instead, they turned me into a recruitment tool and let her die while I was unconscious for weeks of procedures. The building shuddered again, and more alarms joined the cacophony. Whatever Paul had triggered was accelerating. The townspeople, I said, pieces clicking together. It's their abilities. Real genetic modifications, enhanced by prosthetics and training. Paul pulled up another screen, showing biological data. Catherine's enhanced senses, Donald's strength, the voice, mimicry, all products of genetic manipulation. But they learned to exaggerate the effects, make themselves seem more monstrous to protect new recruits. Protect them how? Donald answered, by making the transformation seem worse than it is. If you think we're monsters, you resist longer. Gives people like Paul more time to gather evidence. And people like Lily more time to warn you, Catherine added softly. Paul's expression darkened. Lily wasn't transferred, Randy. They killed her yesterday when they discovered she'd been communicating with outside contacts. She died trying to expose this place. The upload bar on his screen hit 90%. 5 minutes until gas release, he continued. This facility will be destroyed, but the evidence is going to every federal agency I could find. FBI, CDC, bioethics committees, congressional oversight. What about the other facilities? This is just one node in a network. But with this evidence, law enforcement can trace the connections, find the others. Paul's voice carried grim satisfaction. It won't bring back the people they've killed, but it might save future victims. The upload completed, just as the ventilation systems changed pitch. I could smell something new in the air, something that made my enhanced senses recoil instinctively. It's time to go, Catherine said, heading for an emergency exit I hadn't noticed before. We followed her through a maintenance corridor that led to a service elevator. As we rose toward ground level, Paul explained the final pieces. Your modifications are permanent, Randy. All of ours are. The genetic changes can't be reversed, but they don't have to define who you become. He looked at Catherine and Donald. These two have been protecting new recruits for months, using their enhanced abilities to fight back instead of recruit more victims. What happens now? Now we run, Donald said, as the elevator opened onto a hidden exit behind the lodge. The research network has resources, connections. They'll hunt us down eventually, but maybe we buy time for the investigation, Catherine added. Maybe we save the next group they tried to recruit. Outside, the lodge looked normal in the pre-dawn darkness, but I could hear mechanical systems engaging below ground. Paul's sabotage was thorough. This place would be nothing but a crater by sunrise. I have a vehicle hidden in the forest, Paul said, leading us away from the building. We can reach the highway before the explosion. As we walked through the trees, I thought about my choice yesterday, transformation or memory erasure. Both options had been lies, but the real choice was simpler. Use what had been done to me to help others, or let the facility's crimes continue. The genetic modifications, I said to Paul. How extensive are they? Significant, enhanced physical capabilities, improved healing, extended lifespan. You're not human anymore, Randy, but you're not a monster either. He paused. What you become depends on what you choose to do with those abilities. Behind us, the lodge erupted in a pillar of flame that lit up the entire valley. The explosion echoed off the mountains, and I knew that whatever evidence hadn't been uploaded was now ash and smoke. So, what do we do now? I asked as we reached Paul's hidden truck. We disappear, Catherine said, climbing into the passenger seat. New identities, new lives. But we stay in contact. Share information about other facilities, and we help other survivors, Donald added. It's people who escaped or were discarded by the program, okay? Build a network of our own. Paul started the engine and pulled onto a dirt road I hadn't known existed. Randy, you came here looking for a fresh start. This isn't what you expected, but it's what you've got. I watched the burning lodge disappear behind us, thinking about Lily's sacrifice and Marcus's broken eyes and all the people who'd been processed through that underground laboratory. My old life was gone, but maybe that wasn't entirely bad. Where do we go first, Nevada? Paul said. There's another facility there, and we have contacts who might help us expose it. As we drove toward the highway, I realized my fresh start had led me to something bigger than I'd ever imagined. The journalism career that had ended in failure had prepared me for this, investigating corruption, exposing the truth, protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. The genetic modifications humming through my bloodstream weren't a curse or a blessing. They were tools, and what mattered was how I chose to use them. Behind us, the facility burned, taking its secrets with it. But ahead of us, there were more facilities, more victims, more chances to fight back. Asterisk, if you've made it this far on HOA Pulse, you already know the truth doesn't stay buried forever. Subscribe, because this story is far from over. Asterisk, my real work was just beginning.